Ladies and gentlemen of On the Line, I'm Jen Gerson, and I'm in Ottawa today to speak to Ross Douthat, New York Times columnist who has recently written a book about why we should all be religious. I don't know if he convinces me, but maybe he'll convince you. That's today on the Line. Why, hello, Ross Douthat from the New York Times. So nice to see you.
So nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Well, welcome to On the Line. Just wanted to have a discussion with you first. You're here up in the Great White North, Ottawa, the middle of November. Bold. Thank you for that. I know that you're here to talk about God, and we're going to get into that. But first, on behalf of the nation,
yes,
I do feel the need to bring this one up.
Yep.
Oh, Canada, come join us, January 2025.
Yes, I wrote a column making a gesture of friendly outreach to our cousins to the north to, lay claim to the North American birthright, the shared North American birthright that should always have been ours.
Look,
what could have been controversial about that?
I really feel like maybe that column failed to read the room a little bit. Like just in a moment when you have your president making overtures toward us to become a 51st state,
yes,
or some kind of tributary thereof.
When we can all agree that certainly at least 9 or 10 states could be added, not just one in the context.
I'm just saying, perhaps some ire, some Canadian ire might have been expressed, and I do think that the response to that column was grumpy. Was that fair to say that people were a bit grumpy with you about that? I
mean, by Canadian standards, not to play into stereotypes, right? But the assumption that Americans make about Canadians is that it's a nation of very polite people, so that grumpiness by Canadian standards is, sort of friendly umbrage by American standards.
Right. So I mean, enraged
in a Canadian way, maybe. I mean, the reality, as you well know, of journalism is that you're looking for opportunities in which your arguments will actually attract attention. And Donald Trump behaving like Donald Trump created an opportunity for, if I'd written a column about a North American Union 5 or 10 years ago, no one would have read it. In this case, many people read it and became, white hot or ice cold, as the case may be with rage. But still, at least some people read it.
I think you're right. If you had written a measured column about the prospect of an economic union with Canada 5 or 6 years ago, there might have been even some people willing to consider that possibility.
Well, economic union is much too limited, though.
You want the whole thing,
for my ambitions. Well, I think that as ridiculous as President Trump's 51st state posturing was, I did find something resonant in his complaints about the ugly line. He's talking about they just drew this line
54-40 fight, babe,
across the country.
Yeah,
and
arbitrary order.
Arbitrary.
Yeah.
If you spend time in the Canadian West and the American West, the Canadian Rockies or the American Rockies, you may notice some similarities of topography and even personality, maybe. Well, it's a shame that these things are impeded in their full flourishing. The other reality is, again, not to sound too American, but when you put together a population map of North America, right, it quickly becomes noticeable that almost all Canadians live within a pretty narrow range of miles or kilometers, if you prefer, even kilomètres, from the American border. And that suggests to me that the United States, let me put it this way, the United States is like a magnet, right? Sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. But I feel like Canada and Canadians have ended up with a kind of worst of both worlds scenario in the last 10 or 15 years, where it seems like Canada traditionally found a way to sort of define its own national identity against the United States, right? Mm-hmm. To be sort of Tory and respectable when America was revolutionary, and to be liberal and secular when America was a bunch of religious cowboys from Texas led by George W. Bush. But I feel like,
miss those days.
I feel like, and you can tell me I'm wrong about this, right?
Okay.
That Canada, especially in the Trudeau years has entered into its own kind of national identity crisis. It's not, Trudeau talked about the post-national nation or something, and even as it has become even more buffeted and influenced through changes in politics and economics, but also just through the internet by trends in the United States. So basically, you're sort of prisoners of our politics without being able to vote, to vote in our politics, to shape our politics directly. And you're also having a crisis of national identity. And it seems like you could solve both problems through
abandoning the national identity.
Through union in a larger shared identity. But, I've read the polls. I know this argument appeals to about 10% of Canadians, slightly more in Generation Z. You get up to 15%. So I'm starting from a low foundation, but I think of this as let's say a 50 to 75 year plan for union.
I do respect the willingness to be provocative on this point, and I will say, as someone from Western Canada, I'm under no obligation to be particularly nice to Ottawa. I only come here when I have to. Thanks for the invitation, or thank you for giving me the opportunity.
I believe that Alberta is the Canadian province where support for union with the United States polls best. It sometimes breaches 15%, Yep.
maybe even 20%, depending
Yep.
on the poll. Look, I think one of the reasons why Canadians got particularly fussy about that column and upset about that column is because you've correctly identified a problem. And that is, I do think that Canada lacks, especially Anglo-Canada, not so much French Canada, does lack a cohesive national identity. And that becomes abundantly clear and a major problem when we're facing a potential cultural, if not economic, incursion by a much larger, more powerful, richer neighbor. I tend to agree that right now, all we have for as a national identity is that we're not America. And that's
Which is what Trudeau specifically, it was the first thing he said.
When Trudeau goes on CNN and says, what's the Canadian identity?
Right.
He's like, but we have a dental program. That's pretty weak, right? That's pretty weak as far as national identities go. And I think that is a conversation that especially English Canada needs to start having with itself, because it's a problem. So yeah, look, there's nothing that makes people angrier at a columnist when a columnist is correct about something. That's just the worst. But what I thought was really interesting about that column, and not to belabor something you wrote a year ago, was that at no point did you stop to consider whether or not America was a country worth joining. Right?
That's true. I did not.
Which is a very American thing to do.
Absolutely, yes. You're never going to convince, someone to join you if you spend a lot of time listing all the reasons someone might not join you. A wooing, no man romancing a woman would say, well, let me also offer you a list of some men would, actually. I shouldn't say that, but
it's a new generation.
It's a new generation,
it's very
right?
Gen Alpha.
But it's not ideal to say, here's a list of the 15 reasons that you might not want to, might not want to marry me or something.
I just think that
I think it is. I don't think it's hard to come up with aspects of American life that someone might not want to participate in. But I am enough of an American chauvinist to suggest that looking ahead across the sweep of the 21st century, I think America is going to be one of the better places to be, flaws and all. And I think that some of the things that Canadians find unpleasant or distasteful about the United States may be slightly exaggerated by the desire to sort of avoid the magnetic pull of the richer and more obnoxious nation to the south.
I'm not going to lie. My group chats right now are filled with news of Olivia Newsy. This is a thing that it's crossed the border.
We'll see right there. You're already trapped in our horrifying media vortex.
It's true.
That is part. I would say the one other thing I'd say about this is that I think that, and again, I obviously don't expect Canada to join the United States anytime soon. But I think that over the last 40 or 50 years, Canada was pretty comfortable with a kind of West in which Europe and America were kind of equally balanced. And Canada almost played a mediating role. It was more European and old world in certain ways than the US, more new world than Western Europe. I suspect over the next 40 or 50 years, European decline is going to be more and more of a stark fact. And Canada, and this is already true, Canada is going to sort of find itself in a world where its southern neighbor is still extremely powerful, and the other major balancing forces in the world are places like the People's Republic of China, which obviously has made its own efforts to gain influence in Canada. And I think, again, independent of the maybe slightly ridiculous, should we actually literally join the US question, there's just a question of, what does Canada do in a 21st century where it's no longer balancing between Western Europe and the United States, and instead the dynamic is more the United States on the one hand or authoritarian powers in Asia on the other. I think that's just a new dilemma for Canada.
Our recent budget does have us making a play for Eurovision. That does count for something.
Yeah, I think it would be a big mistake for the Canadians to go hard on a kind of European identity at this moment in history, but we'll see.
Well, we'll see. The only thing I'm saying is, as much as I think you've correctly identified the not America national identity as being insufficient for the moment, and I would agree with that. Not America is doing a lot of work right now.
Yes.
You're pulling a lot of weight on that.
Yep, absolutely. And I think the nature of the phenomenon that is Donald Trump and this is not a phenomenon that is unique to U.S.-Canadian relations, but Trump has an unparalleled ability to sort of put his finger on spots of trouble and change and issues that elites don't want to talk about, and sort of bring those issues to the fore, and then be totally unable to then do something productive,
like the Epstein files.
Put those things Put things on a stable footing in any way. You just see this on practical issues, right? Like, in the U.S., it's debates about immigration and higher education and all of these things where Trump embodies a critique of conventional wisdom that has a tremendous amount of power, and that's why he has been resilient and has been able to win. But if you say, can Donald Trump, put U.S. immigration policy on a stable footing for the next 25 years, or put, higher education policy on a stable footing, the answer is consistently and repeatedly going to be no. And so just in the same way, can Donald Trump put his finger on this sort of unstated, difficult reality facing Canada in the 21st century? Yes, he absolutely can. Can he make Canadians want to hang out with Americans? Not really, well, except here in this safe space.
In a safe space, like I said, you get much credit for coming to enemy territory.
It's not enemy territory.
In the midst of November, no less.
Yeah, there were some issues landing our plane at the Ottawa airport, and there was actually a pretty stark division. So we had to divert our plane to Syracuse because of fog in Ottawa, and Syracuse is only 3 hours south, but climactically, it did feel like I was crossing some kind of really substantial frontier, which maybe into the north, which maybe I underestimated in my optimistic plans for for unity.
Let me say the role of climate in shaping Canadian identity is, I think, not quite as understood or necessarily explored as it ought to be. I do think it does change the way people approach even things like government policy and creating civic institutions and neighborly values, right? When you live in a very brutal climate where you have to potentially depend on your neighbors in a way that you don't in warmer, more affable places. And I mean, it's not that you guys don't have climate issues, but I can tell you stories about getting stuck in the middle of snowbanks in the middle of rural Alberta and having random trucks pull over in the middle of the night and tow me out, right? And being able to trust in random strangers to be able to survive in that way. It creates a different mentality a little bit. Anyway, I'm working on creating a national identity. I'll get to that. Look, we want to talk about God. You're here, you're delivering a lecture here in Ottawa. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, and tell me a little bit more about what your thesis is for that lecture?
Well, I haven't given it yet, so to some degree, it has yet to be discovered. All talks sort of come to their full shape when they're actually given. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of shape of debates about religion and arguments about religion in Western culture right now, because I think there's been a really interesting shift over the last 5 years or so, where we went through a period of sort of accelerated secularization, especially in the US, but In Europe, secularization had already sort of reached a further limit. Canada is somewhere in between. But we went through this period of deepening secularization that sort of hit, if not an endpoint, at least a plateau 3 to 5 years ago. And now we're in a landscape where it's not that there's exactly a religious revival, but there is sort of renewed interest in religion, renewed interest in having arguments about religion. There are some indicators of actual revival in the most secular parts of the West, in France and the United Kingdom. In the United States, it's more that the number of non-religious people has stopped going up for the moment. But you do have a lot of anecdotal stories about conversions in college towns, and sort of the most people in the most secular parts of the country, people in the intelligentsia, people in academia, either going back to church or being interested in talking about religion again. So I'm interested in why that's happened, what has changed. I think we have gone through a period in which there was a sort of a narrative of secular optimism that has obviously hit the rocks in pretty important ways. And there were a set of intellectuals, people, the new atheists, these kind of arguers of 15 or 20 years ago who made some pretty concrete predictions about how the world was going to get better if it got less religious. And people look around in the 2020s and say, well, things got less religious and, oops, it's not so great. We're not less polarized. We're not, more neighborly to each other.
No ism without a schism.
That's right. It's not that everyone believes in science now. No, they believe in other weirder, crazier things, right? So there's that reality. There's the extent to which I think life under digital conditions, under internet conditions, has sort of thrown the younger generation into a profound existential funk in which many people who have been raised without any kind of religion are suddenly saying, maybe I could use a community or a metaphysical horizon again. So there's a number of things going on there. But then the question is, what happens next, right? Do you actually get a real religious revival out of this moment, or is it just sort of this temporary moment of reconsideration? And the argument that I make in my most recent book, which is called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, which is sort of an aggressive sales pitch, like my sales pitch to Canadians. All my sales pitches are maybe overly aggressive, but the argument there is that it is in fact much more not just intellectually serious, but maybe intellectually obligatory to take religious questions seriously, to take the possibility or likelihood that there is a God seriously, than a lot of secular people have been conditioned to think. So it's an argument that's sort of made to people reconsidering religion and saying, yes, you should reconsider it, you should take it seriously, there probably is a God. Going back to church is actually a very reasonable thing to do, even if you haven't had flights of angels descending to tell you that you ought to do it. But then the other point, which is not in the book, but which I'm going to try and fold into the talk, because they said they wanted something, about the whole world and the future. Right?
No pressure.
No pressure, right? Is that I think the landscape of the 21st century is just going to be a landscape where what we're seeing now is only the beginning. There's just going to be tremendous pressure on the individual human being, families, communities, nations, to either have a strong self-definition, a strong understanding of their place in the world or the cosmos, a strong reason for existing and trying to continue to exist, or there's going to be sort of obsolescence and disappearance of all kinds of human things. That the pressures of the internet are sort of phase one of this, and then the pressures of artificial intelligence are going to be phase two.
Can you expand a little bit on that? What kind of human things do collapse in the absence of a strong, unifying religious faith?
So what happens is, it's not just religion that collapses. It's more that religion is a potential antidote to collapse. So what you see already under digital conditions, right, is the collapse of a lot of just sort of basic real world ways that human beings related to one another for most of our history, right? That sort of people who relate to and communicate with each other under digital conditions don't do things in reality that used to build community and help men and women meet each other and get married, right? And help families raise children. But also, it ranges from that to, sort of institutions of high culture, museums, ballet, all of these things suffer tremendously under digital conditions. The movies have suffered tremendously under digital.
Going great.
I mean, as a journalist, you don't want to start with journalism. But journalism was, in fact, a leading example where the internet destroyed the economic base for a lot of journalistic enterprises first. And it didn't do away with journalism, but it reduced it. And then it also reduced its connection to reality. Like, my wife was a newspaper reporter, actually not that far from here in upstate New York, in her 20s. And her job was all about reality. She would go out into the Adirondack State Park and find stories and talk to people and exist in the world. And the journalism that has sort of replaced that kind of journalism, because all the newspapers that used to hire people to do that, if they had 50 reporters once, now they have 10, right? So those jobs go away. And in their place, you have things that are, and this is, maybe the wrong thing to say on a video podcast, right? But it's people talking to screens, interacting with each other in digital worlds that can be very interesting. And there's good things about long form podcasting. I run a podcast myself, right? But it is a reduced form of engagement with reality. And I think you see that all over in all kinds of different aspects of life. And one of the effects of that, I think the clear effects, is that people just sort of float through life in these kind of virtual worlds. And it's very easy not to do things that people sort of took for granted for most of human history. And again, some of this is about art and institution building and culture. Some of it is just very basic. People just get married less and have fewer kids at a pace that is going to make, again, not just like a family or a region or a state, but entire nations could just collapse from sort of, in effect, demographic suicide over the course of the next couple of generations. In fact, this will happen in some places. It's already built in. Something terrible is going to happen in South Korea over the next 50 years because their fertility rate is 0.7. So there is no, certain things are sort of already built in. AI, we'll see how far it goes, but it promises to go further, and it doesn't just sort of offer a kind of way to float digitally. It says, and actually, all of the residual things that human beings still have to do, we're going to replace those too, right?
So if I'm going to wear my devil's advocate monstrous atheist hat, which I occasionally put on for fun, I would say, so your solution to these very real problems is the substitution of one kind of fantasy reality with another. You're relying on this idea that people will resolve some of these tensions of the modern world by getting out of one digital fantasy reality and absorbing another kind of unprovable metaphysical ethic. How does that solve any of these problems? And you can't really go back, right? You can't go back in time to the 1950s when everybody, or the 1920s or whatever else, and say back to a time when everybody was an Orthodox Christian believer.
Well, everyone was certainly not an Orthodox Christian believer in the 1950s.
I'm drawing a very generalized argument.
But I want to be clear. There are two separate questions. Okay. One question is religion just a fantasy? Just a kind of metaphysical dress up that has nothing to do with reality? Or does it accurately describe reality? That's question one.
Sure.
Question two is, what is selected for by this kind of turn towards human obsolescence that we're experiencing? I think religion is likely to be selected for over the next few generations, whether it or not it is true. So I'm not saying religion is the solution to this. I'm saying whether you think religion is good or not, it's going to be one of the places, and you can already see this, that one of the the ways of being in the world that encourages human beings to still form families and communities and cultures under conditions that are really hostile to the basic continuity of human things. Doesn't mean it's true. I'm not saying you must be religious in order to survive this evolutionary bottleneck. I'm just saying, and in fact, there will be people going through this period who turn to completely different ideas as a means, and if you look at like people in Silicon Valley looking at these trends, there are people in Silicon Valley who are ready to say, it's really terrible that nobody's having kids anymore under the conditions that we ourselves are creating. And so the solution is we're going to figure out how to build artificial wombs and large, Brave New World style hatcheries or something. There will be a lot of that. There will be people who are seeking technological solutions, technological ways for human beings to continue. There will be people who are perfectly happy with a lot of the human race becoming obsolete as long as they can sort of rule over what remains. So there's going to be a lot of different forces in play. But religion is likely to be one of the more powerful forces because religion offers an account of why the individual human being is valuable. It offers an account of, why it actually matters what you do with your life in reality, that right now more secular sort of thought forms are not offering. Now, it's also helpful that it's true. Well, that's the answer to your question. Is it just metaphysical dress up? No, the answer is no. God is real. You will probably meet him or her or them when you die, and you should be prepared for that. And these things are true regardless of whatever is happening in larger world conditions. I'm just saying, if you look at larger world conditions, there are reasons to think that we've kind of hit a certain limit on secularization and the decline of religion.
So essentially, there's two different arguments here, and I'll summarize
Yes.
here. One is even if it's not true, it's necessary, and your position is, in addition to that, it's also, in your opinion, true.
Yes, but I'm not urging, I wouldn't urge people to be religious because it's necessary. I'm making a prediction. I'm saying it is a form in which human beings, it is a form through which human beings are more likely to resist their own obsolescence, and therefore it is likely to flourish under the difficult conditions ahead. And also it's true.
Healthy religious communities are much more likely to survive and create healthy families than secular communities or non-healthy religious communities.
Yes, I mean, generally communities, and this connects to our lovely discussion about the Canadian-American future.
Sure.
Communities that have a sense of what they're for, that they have some kind of meaningful purpose going forward, and that they are custodians of something valuable from the past, are more likely to survive than communities that don't have those feelings. This is true of nations. A nation that has a sense of who it is, why it wants its own traditions to persist, is more likely to survive the 21st century than one that doesn't. And similarly, a community that thinks that human beings are put in the world for a reason, that it's worth struggling through life, even if you can't see the overall plan, because there is an overall plan, it's worth being fruitful and multiplying, all of these things. That kind of community is also more likely to persist. You don't have to be religious to persist in this environment, but you have to have a sense of purpose and continuity that religion is pretty good at granting people relative to other worldviews right now.
Well, that brings me to the question about American religious revival, because granted, I don't go there. It's not my high school, but it does seem to me that America is going through a religious revival. That religious revival seems to be a particularly strange hybrid of evangelical Christianity and nationalism, essentially a Christian nationalist revival. Again, this is from afar, that's what it looks like to me. And I look at that revival and I'm like, that sort of presents the most toxic elements of Christianity and the most toxic elements of nationalism in one beautiful, perfectly toxic package. So, I mean, would that be a counter-argument to the position that you're making?
I mean, first, I don't think America is going through a religious revival at the moment. I think America is considering whether to have a religious revival, is the better way of putting it. But you don't yet see sort of stark increases in church attendance, the stuff that actually, if you're going to describe something as a revival, more people need to be going to church.
You need to see
right?
commitment.
You need to see commitment. And to the extent that there's a kind of pseudo-religious revival that is performative, where people go on the internet and talk about, sort of God and country and don't actually do anything in reality, then that's not one that's just sort of bad in and of itself, because if there is a God, he probably wants you to go to church and not just shitpost on the internet about Jesus or whatever, pardon my language.
All of us are called in our own special ways.
They are. I mean, look, I post on the internet, I judge.
Some of us were meant to be on Twitter.
Let he who is without tweets cast the first stone, as a wise man said. But yes, for a religious revival that doesn't revive any actual religious practices and that is mostly just subsumed into politics is both bad in and of itself, and it's not going to do the kinds of things that I think actual religion does for people in the world or in eternity. That said, I also think that, the way media works, the way sort of our attention works, politics draws in everything. So people, you read sociological trends through the lens of politics because that's what gets all the attention, right? So I think there is also kind of an impulse to sort of find the most absurd politicized form of religion in America or anywhere else and say, this is what, if there's a religious revival, it must mean this guy talking about Christian nationalism on YouTube. But then you go and actually poll Americans and you're like, all right, well, what is Christian nationalism? Let's ask 5 questions that capture Christian nationalism. And first of all, most conservative Americans don't know what Christian nationalism means. It's really hard to sort of assemble a set of questions that makes it a definable term. It's a term that's very useful to a set of people who are trying to build their own brands as would-be leaders. And it's very useful to people who want to be scared about something frightening that's happening way out to their right. So there's a kind of feedback loop, right? A kind of mutual reinforcement of would-be Christian nationalist influencers and people who think the US is about to be plunged into theocratic darkness. I don't think either of those things accurately describe most of what happens in American religion right now. And to the extent that there is sort of stirrings of actual revival, I think it's not primarily political at all. But it also is, because it's sort of in flux what shape it would actually take, it could be pulled in a lot of different directions. So I don't want to say in 20 years, we won't look back and say, oh, this was pulled in a bad direction. But you don't want to sort of freeze something in certainty based on political categories that are partially only important for understanding debates on YouTube.
Well, fair enough. I'm only seeing this from a distance, but I looked at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, and it strikes me that if there is something resembling a Christian or a religious revival in the United States, it's probably going to look a lot like that and a lot less like the wholesome, family-focused, community-focused Christianity that I think that you would probably espouse.
Well, but the Kirk Memorial had its own sort of internal duality, right? Where there was a set of speakers who were there who wanted to recruit Charlie Kirk to a kind of Trumpist nationalist narrative of smiting liberal enemies. And then there was also a narrative, including from Kirk's own wife, Erica, that was about sort of taking Kirk, who had been, a political operative for most of his life, and framing him primarily as a father, a role model for young men, and an evangelist for Christianity. And both of those were just mixed up together,
or
right?
Mixed up, or another way of saying it is that Christians wanting to have their cake and eat it too.
Well, or Christians Christians wanting to be engaged in politics is not necessarily wanting to have their cake and eat it too. But I think you could go speaker by speaker at that event and see, the culmination was Erica Kirk standing up and saying it's really important as Christians to forgive our enemies, and Donald Trump standing up, Donald Trump, not a Christian, at least in any sort of practical meaning of the term, standing up and saying, sorry, Erica, but I hate my enemies. So it literally
and lots of self-described Christians talking about being clothed in the armor of God in order to pursue the enemies of Christ as defined as liberals and Democrats.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, yes, but fundamentally, there's a version of religion and religious language that, is inherently in conflict with not all, but certain forms of secularism and liberalism. And that is sort of a reality that is just sort of, again, how should I put this? I spent a lot of time reading and debating and arguing with people who were sort of in the secular new atheist camp. And, the way that those writers and thinkers, and this does not apply to all liberals or all atheists, but the way that they wrote and thought about religion was itself a kind of battle to the death with the forces of dark medieval reaction and obscurantism, right? And, there's a whole segment of kind of secular culture that watches sort of, pornographic fantasies like The Handmaid's Tale and tells themselves that this is what's going on. They are locked in a battle with the Republic of Gilead that's about to be established tomorrow and ban female literacy and all of these things that are not, in fact, going to happen in any plausible reality that I inhabit. So I think it shows up on both sides, right? That, and that the narratives of conflict and battle and struggle exist in secular liberal arenas as well as in religious conservative arenas. And people on one side listen to the other side's narratives and say, oh, that's so terrifying. They want to destroy us. They want to kill us, and so on. Yes, but they don't hear how their own narratives fall and land.
But to be fair, and I don't necessarily want to fall into the camp of reflexively defending a Richard Dawkins or a Sam Harris or a Hitchens back in the day. But those guys were polemicists writing, rhetorically sexy books about their beliefs. They weren't running U.S. administrations. They weren't influential in terms of actually setting policy. And nor do I recall any of those people,
the people who
fundamentally wanting to chase out.
The people who actually set policy, for instance, in the last two liberal democratic administrations in the United States, thought that it was extremely important to attempt to sue orders of Catholic nuns into oblivion for failing to cooperate with government mandates in healthcare, right?
Which government mandates in healthcare?
Idea, sorry.
I'm not familiar with this case. Which government mandates?
This is the famous case was an order of nuns called the Little Sisters of the Poor that objected to requirements to supply contraceptive and abortifacient and sterilization procedures, or to cover them under a particular healthcare plan, which is a very different kind of healthcare debate than you have in Canada, because we don't have single payer and so on, right? So you get these sort of particular privatized systems that raise issues around religious liberty. But generally, I think the people in power in sort of liberal systems and orders are very, very comfortable doing things and taking steps that are, fairly radical in their implications, and that are not framed in the language of the armor of God or anything like that. But if you had rolled back, since we are in Canada, right? If you had rolled back the clock on debates about euthanasia to 25 years ago, and you had described the system of euthanasia that Canada has established in the last 5 or 10 years, if I had described it as a religious conservative, I would have been accused by my secular and liberal friends of sort of telling fantastic horror stories, the way I just accuse liberals of using The Handmaid's Tale, right, as a fantastic horror story. And yet, not just in Canada, but all over the Western world, sort of a regime around euthanasia, assisted suicide, that even liberals would have been opposed to a generation ago, has become very rapidly normalized. right, as just sort of a normal part of what a good secular liberal is supposed to support. It's not clear to me why religious conservatives looking at that landscape need to step back and say, we're fanatics and extremists, and our enemies are moderate and reasonable. I think there's plenty of sort of utopian fanaticism, and I mean, honestly, I don't actually think the push for euthanasia flows from utopian fanaticism. I don't want to overstate that. I think it actually flows from an ideology of post-religious despair, which is a bit different.
Well, also, it actually flowed from a lot of people wanting to have more control over their ends in the face of terminal cancer diagnosis.
Yes.
Which is not to say that the criticisms of our current euthanasia regime are ungrounded. There absolutely have been some fairly horrific examples and excesses. But one thing that I do think is worth noting here is that Canada oftentimes for America serves as a kind of cartoonish example of the best and the worst of secular liberal policies. I go and I listen to Joe Rogan's version of Canada, and I get a kind of unnuanced, cartoonish idea of, mass censorship and mass debanking and all of everybody's being oppressed.
It's only a little debanking.
Well, only a tiny little. Well, I'm not defending the debanking either, but neither did people who actually did inquiries into that subject.
No, there's a lot. I think it is fair to say that there's a general tendency towards caricature. I'm just offering this because I feel like the narrative of Christian nationalism in America as a set of, a sort of politics of, here's the other thing about Christian nationalism in the US, such as it is. The Trump administration is, all of its sort of primary policy interests have very little to do with the sort of traditional agenda of religious and social conservatives in the United States, right? The centerpieces of Trump administration policymaking are around immigration, which is an issue where they've ended up in conflict, not so much with conservative evangelicals, but certainly with the US Catholic bishops and other religious groups. Immigration enforcement is a big issue on the political right. It's not a big issue for religious conservatives historically. Religious conservatives' big issues are issues like abortion, where the Trump administration has done very little and has basically attempted to avoid doing anything substantially pro-life at a national scale because it doesn't want to touch the issue. Issues around transgenderism and debates related to that, where the Trump administration has done things that religious conservatives support, but that reflect basically a sort of rollback of a very extreme set of policies embraced by the Biden administration. I just think the Trump administration includes within its ranks people like Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, who are very comfortable with a kind of chest-thumping, rah-rah religious rhetoric about politics. But I think you misunderstand Trumpism if you see it as primarily driven by specific religious conservative concerns taking over the policy-making apparatus. I don't think that's what's happening.
My read on the Trump administration is that the religious conservatives and Christian nationalists are a faction of power within a wider coalition. But also,
right. But if you roll back,
you also just rolled back Roe versus Wade, largely in the result of a Trump administration judicial appointees, thanks to a lot of that. So, I don't think that a lot of these factions are without power or influence either.
No, I don't. I wouldn't say that they're without power or influence. But if you said, do religious conservatives, the conservative victory in Roe v. Wade was something that was built up sort of generationally over decades and decades of argument and judicial appointments and so on. And as soon as it happened, the national leaders of the Republican Party ran away from its any kind of implications for national policy very quickly. So that should tell you something about the relative power of different groups. Also, if you go back to George W. Bush administration, right, the period when the beautiful days of the cowboy, right? George W. Bush talked about religion in public way more than Donald Trump. His administration, on multiple levels, was more informed, I think, by a very specifically evangelical religious perspective on the world. than the Trump administration is. And if you took these polls of like who is a Christian nationalist, there's no question that more Americans were Christian nationalists as technically defined in 2003 than are in 2025, right? We have, to go back to where I started, we have lived through a period of sustained secularization in the United States. The country is less religious now than it was a generation ago. In that environment, as people look around and say, maybe we miss religion, maybe we need it after all, there's a lot of forces out there, Christian nationalism, one of them, that are sort of contending for influence, that are in different ways maybe weirder and wackier and more extreme than the normie Christianity of 1999. But that's why the moment is interesting, right? And there are forces also that, one thing worth stressing too about this moment is it's not a binary between Christianity and secularism, right? There's a way in which the culture right now is in a kind of 1970s zone where there's lots of people who can't get all the way to a belief in, a father God who's way up there who made the whole universe, right? But who can who are interested in like spiritual powers intermediate powers that might be out there, right? So you get interest in witchcraft and neo-paganism, you get interest in UFOs, you get interest in psychedelic mediated spiritual experiences, and then the AI stuff has a religious edge and element too, right? They talk about, are we inventing consciousness in a laboratory somewhere, somewhere in Northern California? So that's also part of what makes this moment striking, but also why I want to sort of push against too much of a narrative that says, well, religion means Christian nationalism, and so you have Christian nationalism here or secular liberalism over there. Politics sort of flattens realities that, in terms of people's actual beliefs, are more complex and interesting and dangerous too, right?
Yeah, I think that is definitely something that when I talk to people who are more secular, that there's a mistake that if you say you're religious or you're Christian, they slot you into a belief that, therefore you must be a conservative nationalist, blah, 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 and that's just not true.
Right. It is true that most, there's more conservative people are religious right now than liberal people. But these things also cut across lines of ethnicity and class and really interested, like the Democratic Party in the United States has a lot of very religious members. They're just African American and Hispanic. Democratic Party is the party of very secular white people and more religious minorities. And then Canada is, because your patterns of immigration are different from ours, non-Western religions, Islam, but also actual non-Abrahamic religions are likely to play a much bigger role in Canadian culture in the next 30 or 40 years than is the case in the US. So
interestingly, Cardus recently did a study and found that the religious sort of breakdown of conservatives in Canada more or less matches the religious breakdown of Democrats in the United States.
Well, that's, yeah.
Just kind of tells you a lot there. I want to quickly talk about tradcaths, because I think this is a really interesting phenomenon, is that I keep on reading about a lot of conversion, not just to evangelical Christianity in the United States, but there's also seemingly a growth of conversion to traditional Catholicism in the United States. There's a movement, particularly among young people. You're a well-known Catholic writer at the New York Times. What I find really fascinating, I was raised Catholic myself, what I find really fascinating about a lot of the growth of traditional Catholics, particularly from the conservative side, is they seem to be increasingly at odds with some of the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church around social welfare and immigration, for example. I mean, one thing that I find deeply hilarious now is when I go onto Twitter and click on Pope Leo, there's now a giant collection of reply guys who are, you can just tell, recently converted Catholics who disagree with his positions.
Or are converted to, the challenge with reply guys, right, is knowing, are these guys actual converts to Catholicism? Are they playing it on the internet, right?
But even if they're just playing it on the internet, it's an interesting phenomena, right?
Yes,
I sort of see J.D. Vance as falling into the recent convert reply guy tradcath category, right? It's a different, there's a weird sort of internal movement in in Catholicism right now, at least as far as I can see from where I am. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that tension between conventional or traditional Catholicism and the teachings of the church, which increasingly seem to be coming up at odds with MAGAism, the Trump administration, particularly on issues of refugees, immigrations,
Yeah,
social welfare.
I think there is a sort of sustained tension that is sharp right now with Trump, but exists in a substantial way in Western Europe, all of Europe for a while now, between what conservative Catholics think about immigration and what the sort of bishops and the Pope tend to say about immigration. But that also reflects this kind of, it's not just a matter of people who are politically conservative and Catholic are putting their politics before their faith. There's also generational issues where the people in, the Catholic Church is a gerontocracy in the sense that, like,
quite literally,
quite literally, bishops,
and quite purposefully,
archbishops and cardinals and the Pope tend to be quite old, right? And there is I think, a generational difference in views about immigration that shows up in the Catholic Church too, right? Where there's sort of an older generation of sort of, you could call them liberal universalist optimists, and a younger generation that sees sort of mass immigration as this kind of incredibly destabilizing force. And in Catholic terms, what the tension then becomes, again, I think it's sharper. It's historically been sharper in Europe than in the US, because in the US, for a long time, most immigrants were coming from Catholic countries, right? Whereas in Western Europe, this was not the case. Western Europe, you have a dynamic of a Christian teaching about the need to welcome the stranger and welcome the refugee being understood by a lot of Catholics as being used to basically sort of Islamicize Western Europe. That's the tension in the mind of the Western European Catholic conservative, especially, right? That yes, you have this religious obligation to treat migrants well, but if the effect of mass immigration policy is to take formerly Catholic countries and make them increasingly non-Catholic, then isn't there some tension there? I guess that's what a lot of people in sort of in Europe would say, and the Church is effectively trying to navigate those tensions. But I think in the U.S., there's also the weirdness of the Biden administration had a particular immigration policy that was entered into somewhat accidentally, that became a kind of total open door to mass migration for about 3 years. That was tremendously unpopular. And the Trump administration was elected in part with a pretty clear mandate to do something about that. And there was sort of an initial popularity to the Trump administration's measures. And now we're a year in and we've moved from securing the border to actually trying to do mass deportations. And in practice, there's just a lot of people who are for a secure border and don't like what you have to do mass deportations. And that's not a religious question exactly. But that's sort of the politics of the thing, right? In that you have to understand these things, like in terms of what did the previous administration do? What is, the public is always conflicted on immigration. There's always a sense of like, well, immigration is good and we should be welcoming, but if you do it too fast, it turns into chaos. And so you had what felt like chaos that led to support for restriction, but now at a certain point, restriction comes to seem cruel, and then the pendulum swings back. I'm taking us away from religion. Let me pull back to religion. What with traditional Catholicism, I think you have a pattern that affects Catholicism. It affects conversions to Eastern Orthodoxy, which a colleague of mine at the Times just wrote a story about. But among especially, I think, highly educated Americans, but it's true in other Western countries too, there's a really strong appetite right now for what seem like demanding liturgical forms of religious faith. But it's not clear how big that demand is and how far it extends outside a kind of self-conscious would-be elites. So like it seems like there's a weird inversion with Catholicism in the US, where historically Catholicism was the mass religion, the religion of the working class immigrants, and then the elites were all Protestant. But if you look at, certainly in conservative politics right now.
My husband really misses that era.
Yeah, so now, I mean, Charlie Kirk was sort of an outlier. Many of the leaders, many of sort of the conservative elites in America are Catholics. Some are cradle Catholics. Many are converts to Catholicism. Catholicism is stronger in elite America in certain ways than it's ever been before. But the church as a whole in the U.S. is still losing members, is losing members to Pentecostalists and evangelicals, right? Mm-hmm. And it's becoming weaker as a mass religion, even as it becomes more influential as an elite religion. And it used to be that in America, you would have a pattern where someone would be raised Southern Baptist or non-denominational or Pentecostalist, and they would go to college and they would sort of make a kind of almost like class-based conversion to Presbyterianism or Episcopalianism, mm-hmm. right? That was sort of the hierarchy. And now you get very, very few conversions to mainline or high church Protestantism. Those traditions, if you're like on a college campus or something, those often feel sort of liberalized to the point of irrelevance. And so there's a stereotype of like the young evangelical who goes to an Ivy League school and becomes a trad cath. That's a real pattern. But it is a pattern that is concentrated in elite professional class circles and is not what you would find in the suburbs of Iowa or something like that. There is no mass stampede of people out of non-denominational churches into Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy in Oklahoma or Iowa or any of these places. If anything, the trend is still somewhat the reverse.
It's an interesting question because it makes me wonder, do people who operate in elite circles of society, people who operate in highly intellectual fields, are their religious needs fundamentally different than somebody who is, having a perfectly happy family life in Iowa or Idaho or someplace like that?
I think that there's a need. There's both what you would call, we'll just call it like good and bad needs that people feel in those circles. I think there's a good need, which is for robust intellectual grounding for your faith, mm-hmm. where you feel like you can defend it and take it seriously when you're surrounded by secular people who wear the atheist hat and think it's all nonsense, right? And the old liturgical religious traditions often just have more of that philosophical ground, like Roman Catholicism, whatever else it has going for it. It's got a lot of philosophers.
Yes.
It's got a lot of philosophers in its back pocket in the way that your evangelical megachurch probably does not.
Right.
So that's a positive attraction. There's also, though, probably a certain kind of, sort of snobbery, right, that you get at the elite level, where it's like Catholicism is, ancient and serious and has pretty architecture, and the megachurch seems a little embarrassing. And so it's similar to why someone who was a Baptist in 1930 would become an Episcopalian when they went to Harvard or something, right? So both those kind of things are in play.
Catholics have much better churches. It's just architecture.
Well, not
art.
everywhere. I mean, not the post-Vatican II churches, and I'm sure Canada is there are a lot of suburban churches built in North America in the 1970s that I do not think are an advertisement for the riches and depth of the Catholic tradition. But yes, apart from that unfortunate period in Catholic architecture is better than megachurch architecture. Yes,
I'm saying even post-Vatican II churches don't look like malls. I'm just saying.
There's some that look like suburban gymnasiums and dungeons, but yes, generally, I don't know, but you also have to give, there is clearly a way in which people in elite circles, intellectual circles, and professional circles can underestimate the resilience and adaptability of sort of the suburban megachurch, right? Like one thing I think that you saw a bit of at the Charlie Kirk Memorial too was, evangelical Christianity, it just exists outside the elite. It's always been disdained by the elite. And there's always this expectation in the elite that it will sort of, either it will take over in some terrifying Handmaid's Tale style way, or it will just retreat back into backwoods revivalism and sort of disappear as a cultural force. And in a way, what you saw at the Charlie Kirk Memorial was people saying like, no, we're still here. It's not that evangelicalism is booming, but it is a profoundly resilient part. It's the most resilient part of Christianity in an age of secularization. And those of us who are not part of it, who are going to, liturgical churches with smells and bells and ancient philosophical traditions, we have to give some credit to the suburban megachurch for being a resilient source of serious religious practice in a more secularized age, and also a place that is not just sort of a font of political partisanship, but is in fact a zone of religious community and social outreach and all of those things. Like the average suburban non-denominational church in America is not especially political, right? It's not what you would think from like the guys who call themselves Christian nationalists too. Like I would just urge any viewers, if you go, there's two kinds of Christian nationalism, right? There's sort of a traditional kind, which is a megachurch pastor who's got the American flag behind him and, has a kind of narrative of how God loves the USA, probably really strongly supports Israel for, sort of a mix of theological and political reasons, right? That's real. That's been a big part of American life for my entire lifetime. Then there's also the sort of podcast bro,
right,
who's got a beard much bigger than mine, who's here to tell you about why women shouldn't vote, and
Good luck with that.
That is interesting and important in a context where everything is up for grabs, but is not the defining reality of religious faith in the American heartland or anywhere else.
Well, I hope that's true. That's true and continues to be so as a woman who likes to vote, but is nonetheless not an American.
Yeah, I mean, if you there's evangelical Christianity in the United States is filled with it's just suburban. It's like suburban America. It's dads who are really into girls basketball. You shouldn't let the dads who are into girls basketball and who would never dream of repealing the 19th Amendment, let's put it that way. And maybe that will change. And again, I think it's a moment of deep instability all over, and religious instability is part of that. But you want to recognize how much of even religious culture in America and Canada is still pretty normie and normal.
God, let's keep it that way. Ross Douthat, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with me on the line.
You're very welcome. I feel like we covered all of the most fraught issues in North America.
We solved it all.
In this wonderful continental union
Wonderful.
of ours. Yes.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Cheers.